In this video, we're going to see how to enforce data validation rules on an Oracle table using a check constraint. The context for this example will be a small family counseling practice where we're scheduling counseling sessions for clients to be conducted by counselors at specific dates and times. So let's take a look at the client table, the list of clients. We've got just 6 clients here in this table at this point, and we're not going to be modifying that table, but we'll be referring to it. We're going to be putting this constraint on the appointment table. So let's take a look at that appointment table. First, we'll build it in an unconstrained way. So this table is going to have a unique identifier as an appointment ID, the name of the counselor who's conducting the counseling. Client ID will just be a number that refers to the client over here from the client list. The room number will be where the counseling session is scheduled to take place, a start time, and then a duration in minutes. So we've created that table. And we'll go ahead and enter some test data. So let's bring in 4 records that will get us started. And we'll take a look at those records. So here we've got 3 appointments scheduled for Quinn Fowler to counsel clients number 100, 101, and 102. That's Ashley, Sandra, and Clive. And Elizabeth Baker has an appointment as well. Here's our task then. It's to insert a record that has these characteristics. And what I really want to point out here is that the duration on this one is really short. So normally we'd expect to see durations of around 55 minutes and 30 at the very least. Right now, because Oracle is not enforcing any check constraints on this table, then this record is going to be able to insert without any objection. And so here's the insert statement. And that record is accepted just fine. And we'll notice that if we try to insert one that's really long, 125 minutes, longer than the longest scheduled appointment or the longest appointment that the counseling practice wants, which would be 115 minutes. So this one is going to be too long, but because there's no constraint on the table yet, that one's inserted as well. And so we can see those 2 records make it into the table just fine. Let's go ahead and drop this table and then recreate it with some constraints on it. In this case, we're going to go ahead and create the table just the way that we did before, but before we close off the parentheses, we're going to add a constraint, and we'll do that with the keyword constraint. We'll then give it a valid name, and the name will be valid duration. So the idea is that we're going to put a constraint on what the boundaries are allowed for that duration to be. And specifically, this constraint is going to be a check constraint. We then open parentheses, and we put a condition that indicates, well, a condition that must evaluate to true if the record will be allowed to be added to the table. And so we're going to say for this record to be added, for any record to be added, the duration has to be greater than or equal to 30. And the duration has to be less than or equal to 115. We'll close off the parentheses, close off the table, and then create it. Let's go ahead and insert our 4 test records in again, and then we'll take a look at what we've got. So now we're back to where we started before we tried to enter that 25-minute record. Let's go ahead and enter that one again. Now we've got a constraint in place. It's going to check to make sure that the value that's entered, that's supplied for the duration, is at least 30 minutes. And so when we try to insert that record, we see that the name of our check constraint, called valid duration, is violated. So that record is not allowed to go into the table. Similarly, if we try to insert a record that's too large, 125 minutes, then that check constraint is violated. And if we look at the table, we'll see that those records did not get inserted. Now let's go ahead and adjust that lower end, bump it up by a few minutes so that it's just barely on the inside of the boundaries, 30 minutes, and we'll see that that record is allowed to be created. And the same thing for a 115-minute record. And if we take a look at that table again, we'll see that those records did make it into the table. All right, so let's take a look at another variation on how we can create that check constraint. So we'll drop the table, and let's go ahead and create the table again. That's how we created it last time. Constraint, valid duration, we set as a check constraint, and then specified the condition. Well, it turns out that this part right here, constraint valid duration, isn't required. I can skip that and just go straight to the check. Tell it what kind of constraint it's going to be, and then add in the condition. In so doing, because I'm not specifying a name, Oracle is going to pick a name for me, and that's going to be just fine. So I'll close off the table and create it. And so that's the second syntax that we can use to create that check constraint. Now, one of the things that might be really interesting to do is to say, well, listen, since we're scheduling appointments for the future, let's add a constraint that says the start time has to be greater than or equal to the current date from the system clock. And so the way I read the current date from the system clock is using the function sysdate from Oracle. And so that tells me there's the current date from the system clock. So let's go ahead and drop the table, and we'll create it again. And this time, we're going to try to add a check constraint that says the start date has to be greater than or equal to the system date. It seems like a pretty reasonable thing to do. However, when we try to create that table, Oracle says it doesn't understand start date. The reason is the only thing I'm allowed to use in a check constraint is I'm allowed to refer to other columns in the current table to look at the values that are coming in and constant values. So I'm not able to run a function at this point. If I really wanted to enforce that constraint, it would take a more complex approach to enforcing the constraint using a trigger. That'll be the subject of a later video. And so that approach doesn't work. But we can build a constraint that looks specifically at constant values. So let's suggest that our room numbers have to be bounded by 1 and by 5, and only 5 rooms to work with. And so, just to show that we can have multiple constraints on one table, we'll put the first part of this constraint as one check constraint, and then we'll build the second part of the constraint as a second check constraint, and then we'll go ahead and close off the table. And then what we'll see is that this constraint gets added just fine. Well, those are the ins and outs of how we create a data validation rule using a check constraint on an Oracle table.